found myself in the woods behind my home. Story by Weird Bryce Guy. Since it will become obvious soon enough as I recount my experience, I'll go ahead and admit that I had gone to the woods to kill myself. Sometime earlier, well before my inspiration for suicide, I had heard that some animals slink away from their dwellings or packs to be alone during their final moments. I suppose that this fact, well, true or not, had compelled me to also leave my home, venture into the woods, and take my own life. The actual reason behind my desire to die is irrelevant and would take too much time to explain anyway. It's no longer present within my heart, and I want only to live peacefully for as long as nature and God would allow. The reason for this change of heart and the experience which I've decided to share is very terrible. If you aren't someone who can tolerate grimness, I suggest you stop listening now. Perhaps go read or watch something light-hearted, or skip to the next story. But if you're interested in a story I have to tell, and if you can steel yourself against the dreadful and macabre, by all means get comfortable and listen. As I mentioned, I wanted to die, and I decided the best place to carry out the deed was in the heart of the woods behind my house, which is densely vegetated, being ignored and untended by both the inhabitants of the neighborhood and those who service it. I figured that I could not only commit the act there, but that my body would also be left undiscovered for quite some time, if ever. There were no real paths that led through it, and the uneven and weed-choked terrain prevented it from being a reasonable shortcut through the neighborhood. During the summer, it was a den of ticks, snakes, and other things you wouldn't want to come across. A perfect place for an uninterrupted suicide. After several minutes of bushwhacking, although I avoided making my route too clear, I came to a spot where I could see myself comfortably coming to an end. It wasn't really a clearing, but the undergrowth was lower there, bowed beneath a tree. Couldn't begin to tell you the species, and the enclosing foliage was not as unappealing in appearance as others I had passed. I won't call it tranquil. It was still ugly and wild, but it was the best I figured I would find. I had brought a knife with me, preferring something silent, even though I owned guns. I had no one to say goodbye to, and was mortally determined to carry out the act, so without any sort of preamble, I sat against the tree and brought the blade across my throat. I wouldn't go into detail about the sensation, it still unsettles me, but I will say that had I thought to bring a gun, I would have hasted my death, regardless of who would have heard the shot. As I sat against the trunk of the tree, my throat leaking into a fountain, I noticed the flowers and leaves above me seemed to lean towards my body. Vines sprang from the ground as animate as snakes and curled themselves around my ankles. I heard the groaning of branches overhead and saw their shadows move oddly on the ground, as if they strained downward. The sun was setting and the shadows were almost monstrous in appearance. Everything about me, everything natural, seemed intent on reaching me, on making contact with my body. But not just with my body, but with my blood. Petals scooped up the droplets and rivulets that rolled down my shirt. A fallen leaf, severed with intent, no doubt, gracefully fell from the tree and onto my head, was then wind-swept down to my neck and wrapped itself around my throat with apparent sentience, sealing the wound, drinking from it. I was the fountain for some sylvan thirst, and while I should have been terrified by the unnatural animation of plant life, something about it seemed more hospitable than parasitic. I did not feel drained, despite having the sensation that something was being taken from me. There was no lightheadedness, nor bodily fatigue. The pain in my neck soon ebbed away, and I was left only with a tickling feeling as the leaf hungrily pulsated over the wound. Turning to my right, I saw that the knife I had used was almost completely buried in the grass, and upon pulling it out, I saw that the blade was cleaned of the blood which had coated it just moments before. The blades of grass that had touched it rocked back and forth, as if swaying drunkenly. Just when they actively started to become too eerie to handle and actual fear threatened to break the odd tranquility, the various appendages of nature receded, and I was again left untouched. I rose and looked around, but saw nothing, which would have given any indication that nature had assumed an almost predatory state. I examined myself and noted no punctures or wounds, which would have been evidence of the vampiric action I had witnessed and felt. I was confused, and while the desire for death hadn't yet left me, curiosity had taken a momentary hold of my mind, and I wanted to learn about the phenomenon, if it had actually happened, before fully committing myself to the soil. The desire to know, regardless of the information sought, always seems more powerful than any other conflicting impulse. I was about to make my way out of the woods and return home when I saw someone standing not far ahead. In the diminishing sunlight, I could still discern more than their physical form, and saw that they were totally naked. But the experience of just moments before, the dying light, and any other effects on my mind and perception rendered me incapable of seeing, or maybe accepting, their face. I had unintentionally gone towards them, and upon coming within a few feet of the spot at which they stood, finally saw their identity. It was my face, and when I closely looked over the rest of them, my body as well. This copy turned to me, smiled, and with a dual arm gesture, indicating the spread of wood around us, for some reason I couldn't tell, it didn't speak, but continued smiling as if waiting for me to come to some revelation regarding her presence. I looked around, but saw nothing that I hadn't seen before. Then the copy pointed to me, and then to itself, as if to confirm that it was indeed a simulacrum. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but when trying to project my voice, I felt a sensation comparable to a hiccup or soft burp, and no sound exited my throat. I tried again, with no greater success. For some reason, I couldn't speak. The copy smiled sympathetically, then came towards me. Before I could act, offensively or defensively, I doubt in that moment I would have been able to think of the appropriate action, it seized my wrist and removed the knife I'd still held in my hand. Taking the knife, still smiling, it quickly slit open my belly and stepped away. There was no pain. There was not even blood. Dumbfounded, I watched as leaves fell from my stomach in place of bowels. A semi-transparent fluid trickled out, like the ichor of some thick wine, but nothing resembling human viscera came out. I was horrified. I would much rather have preferred to see blood-soaked innards slip from the gash in my gut than the stuff of plants. I looked up to the copy and, despite my wound, violently recoiled, almost falling backwards at seeing its latest expression. I want to use words such as satanic, abominable, wicked, but I feel none of these accurately relate the evilness of that face. To see myself in that detestable way, it would later prevent me from ever looking into a mirror again. Without speaking, the copy mimicked the violence it had done to me on itself. It brought the blade across its belly, but instead of leaves and plant fluid, blood and the glistening surfaces of intestines peeked through the wound. It let them burst outward for a moment, as if to let me really see and accept its body's contents, then put its hand to the wound. Upon taking it away, the wound was sealed. The abdominal contents back in place. Terror overtook me. During its presentation, I had put together the facts of the situation and realized that some sort of exchange had been made between the plant life and myself. My lifeblood had been extracted and used to create some ghastly facsimile. In return, I had been given the body of leaves and some water-like substance. Evidently nature had discerned my desire for death, but decided that it would send forth its own version of me for some sort of unnatural purpose. What I was meant to do in my plant-like state, I never found out. The next few moments happened so fast I can barely recall them now with clarity as I sit at my desk. I remember an anger rising in me, an indignation at nature's gall. Sure, I had come to its domain to die, but it had no right to copy me, to continue the identity I was determined to end, even if I wouldn't have to suffer through it. Having this sudden fury, I remember lunging at the copy, tackling it to the ground, somehow snatching up the knife. I was sure that it would be stronger, and stabbing it over and over again. Then, in a moment of what I can only describe as madness, I drank from its various wounds, really sucking up the blood that spilled out. Leaving the knife sheathed in its heart, I sank my hands into the blood pooling around its body and smeared it all over myself. I scooped up some of the viscera, which had been exposed to the open air, and shoved it inside my still opened gut. It was gruesome, morbid, but in the moment it felt absolutely necessary. I returned home later that night, feeling, in a word, refreshed. And that was a week ago. I want to be prideful and say that I've beaten nature, that even at his most vulnerable, man can still triumph against the earth's most invasive agents. But yesterday, while letting my dog out to do its business, I swear that I saw something lurking just behind the tree lines of the woods that border my house. Something that looked nude, stooped, and weak, but bearing the unmistakable figure of a human being. I think that sooner than later I should make another trip into those woods and put an end to myself once and for all.